Okay. So good afternoon and good evening, and welcome back to the new semester. And also thank you very much for joining us in this first CFPR seminar series. And so I'm very honored today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniel Goodkind. Dr. Goodkind is currently a statistician and a demographer at the International Programs Center Demographic and Economic Studies Branch, U.S. Census Bureau. Of course, he presents his seminar today as an independent researcher. His work at the U.S. Census Bureau since 1998 has involved considerable demographic analysis and international technical assistance. Overall, Dr. Goodkind's research on demographic trends in Asia has clustered around four major themes: zodiacal birth timing, sex ratio imbalances, aging, and the impact of population policies. His work has appeared in the form of impactful policy reports, as well as journal articles in prestigious outlets such as Demography, Population Studies, Population and Development Review, Social Forces, Journal of Marriage and Family, among others. And so without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Goodkind to present his work on the transformative demographic impact of China's Great Malthusian Campaign 1970 to 2021, the minority role of one-child limits. And so still following our convention, we'll let Dr. Goodkind to finish his presentation first in about 45 minutes, and then followed up by a Q&A. And so Daniel, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Let me see if I can just remove, whoops.
Yeah.
Okay, this side I can, something blocking my screen. But okay, thank you everyone for joining. I'd like to start by thanking your center for inviting me to present here today. I'd like to thank Jung for moderating and Puk for getting the ball rolling. And I also wanted to congratulate your center. I think that this is a 10-year anniversary, if I understand correctly.
Yes, correct.
So that's kind of a major achievement. A center such as yours doesn't just come about by accident. It's a lot of hard work and dedication which is required. So you should be very proud about that. So I'm going to present on this topic, the transformative demographic impact of China's, what I call China's Great Malthusian Campaign. And I'm going to emphasize the minority role of one-child limits. I'm just going to dive right in here. For a half century, China had, just a second here, if I could, I'm going to try to move something off my screen so I can see a little better. There we go. Okay. I am stuck now. I can only go backwards. There we go. Pardon me,
Yeah,
some technical issues. It's 11 p.m. at night here, so I'm just going to blame everything on it being almost midnight. So this is a summary of the presentation on this first slide here. For half a century, China, as many of you know, had a compulsory program to control the size of its population. A few years ago, there was a big controversy that erupted over an article that I had published in the journal Demography. There was coverage in Science magazine, and then there was exchange in Demography itself. And the controversy continues today. Yet I'm going to try to convince you today that the underlying debate is less about measurement than just what to call the program. The phrase one-child policy has long been recognized as a misnomer because it under-describes the overall program. So I'm going to start by discussing ambiguities of language and labeling. I'll talk about some of the previous debates over measurements, and then I'm going to show the misnomer to be further flawed because one-child limits actually played a minority role in its two most widely recognized consequences, population reduction and missing females. And then just to dive right into the motivation, why should we care about this? Here's reason one. Some of you may know that China, after 50 years of an antenatal program, it fully reversed course in July of 2021 in a policy document that actually called for sweeping pronatal reforms. And apparently, the final blueprint of that report is going to come out in 2025. So that's going to be the new blueprint for who knows how long. But that program is being assembled without a rigorous accounting of the impact of its prior antenatal program. And here's a link to some discussion that came out in November of last year. The second reason is probably even bigger. China implemented this long Malthusian campaign because it thought that slower population growth would speed up economic development and aid in the rejuvenation or rise of the Chinese nation. And there's a lot of evidence of that all around us. So the simplest question you can possibly ask yourself is, to what extent did this population limitation campaign actually contribute to China's rise? And before we can answer that, we really need demographers to account for the campaign's role in reducing birth rates and population, independent of those other developmental factors that we all know would have reduced fertility anyway. So this is kind of a work in progress for more than 30 years. This is the first paper that I wrote on this topic way back in 1992 when I was a postdoctoral fellow in Australia. Basically, I was preparing for a year of field work in Vietnam. Vietnam at the time had what they called the 1 or 2 child policy, which was inspired by China's program. And I was preparing myself for trying to investigate the impact of that program in Vietnam. And I thought I should start by just understanding the impact of China's program in China. So I tried to estimate averted births in China for the first 2 decades after 1970 by comparing it to other societies in East Asia and Southeast Asia, including Singapore. And actually, this research goes back even before that. I started graduate school in 1987, and just before that, I was studying Chinese. I was studying Chinese in Taiwan, and with one of my tutors, I came across this article here from the Minsheng Bao, which is a Taiwan daily paper, June 22, 1987, and this is a cartoon which is about, how do I explain this? There was a boom in births in Taiwan in 1976, and there was some concern that the boom might occur again in 1988. And Taiwan put together what you might call an anti-dragon baby campaign to try to prevent people from timing their births into the dragon year of 1988. So these 3 figures standing over the couple in bed here are, I believe, the Family Planning Agency, Public Health Bureau, and a doctor. So they were exhorting them not to try to time their births again into the dragon year because, in part, there were the cohorts of school children were staggered, so that was creating problems for the Education Bureau. At the time, the Family Planning Bureau was concerned about bringing birth rates down, so they didn't want anything to bring them back up. And there was a slight rise in infant mortality in 1976 in the dragon year when the births piled up at the end of the year. So they were trying to prevent people from having this the same phenomenon in 1988. And actually, Singapore, I became very interested in because the fluctuations in Singapore in the 1970s and especially the 1980s were even greater than in Taiwan. And so when I did my field work for my dissertation, actually Singapore was my first stop. I spent some time at your university. I was in university housing for about a week, I think. And I was in your library for I think for 2 days down in the basement, looking for articles like this one, using what they called microfiche machines, where there were like tapes of or photographs of journals and newspapers, and just flipping through them to look for headlines like this, just to try to understand what the context was for all this. So in any case, I'm bringing this up in part because this cartoon, if you take away all of the words you see up here in Chinese and English, and imagine this to be a couple in China, and imagine these figures here to be perhaps government agencies telling them what to do to adhere to China's birth planning policies. It's kind of the same kind of idea. How do couples react to exhortations about how they should behave? So I think everybody has heard of China's one-child policy. And here are some images that help to kind of reinforce that colloquial term. Over on the left-hand side, we're looking at birth planning or exhortation posters advocating for single children. Invariably, the babies are looking kind of happy. The parents are looking very happy. Everybody is delighted to have a single child. Over on the right-hand side, we see Western literature and books, and you have a very different image. You also have the one-child images, but the impression is that maybe these children are lonely or imperious or spoiled. So the one-child images are the same in China. Well, you see one-child images both in China and outside of China, but the messages that come forward are somewhat different. But when you actually look at some of the books that have been written on this topic, from the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s, here are the 6 major books that I'm aware of that were written in English about China's attempt to control its population. And you see words up here like coercive birth control, strategic demographic initiatives, China's longest campaign, birth planning, and governance of China's population. But you'll notice that there's a phrase that you don't see here, and that is one-child policy. So these are actually very diverse authors here, but they didn't view one-child policy as kind of the central category of concern in these books. So now I'm going to try to review the history of this birth planning Malthusian program in China by using the total fertility rate, which is expected numbers of births that a woman would have during her lifetime based on birth rates by age observed in any given year. This is the timeline in China from 1950 to 2020. And here is a schemata of what I'm calling China's Great Malthusian Campaign. By a common consensus, this campaign began in 1970 during the Cultural Revolution. Population growth targets were announced in 1970 by Zhou Enlai. 1.6% in rural areas and 0.9% in urban areas were considered the ceiling targets for those sectors. And over the next 3 years, there were some what were called leading groups of provinces were formed, and they set up population and family planning bureaus within the provinces. And eventually this coalesced in 1973. This coalesced in 1973 as what was called the later, longer, fewer program, or Wanxishao, where 2 or 3 children was considered the ideal. And then one-child limit started in 1980 under Deng Xiaoping. Oh, by the way, this is Thomas Malthus up here. He doesn't look like such a bad guy, but I'm having him up here at the top because it's really his ideas which inspired this entire program. Malthus actually wrote about China in his writing, and I think Chinese policymakers took notice, and they didn't really like what they read. He presented China as a kind of prototype of a society that was mired forever in poverty because of high birth rates. So one-child limits started in 1980, and they were near universal for about 5 years. But in 1985, there were some expanded exemptions whereby parents, if the first child was a daughter, they could have a second. And there were some other exemptions as well. But at the same time as they expanded the exemptions, they also expanded some of the penalties for people who violated the regulations. And one-child limits lasted up until 2015. There was a previous loosening in 2013, but by 2015, all one-child limits ended. And then here's where it gets a little bit tricky. The other regulations continued up until 2020, 2021, when that new policy document was released, and all of the birth targets and restrictions were lifted. So here I'm trying to come up with ways of periodizing this broad campaign. In the 1970s, we had these leading groups, followed by the later, longer, fewer period. And then after 1980, we have the one-child policy, but there are two rather different definitions that I don't think people realize when they hear this phrase. The most obvious one is a narrow definition, which is based on one-child limits and enforcements of those limits. That lasted from 1980 to 2015. But there's a broader definition as well, because when people talk about the one-child policy, they're typically also bringing up the enforcements and the penalizations for people who didn't comply. The mental leap that you need to make, though, is that those enforcements did not simply apply to one-child limits, but they apply to everything else. Two-child limits, three-child limits, spacing rules. And all of those continued after the formal end of one-child limits. And those came into being during the one-child era. So there's a broader definition of one-child policy that expands, that lasts all the way till 2021. And then this whole thing is what I'm calling the Great Malthusian Campaign from 1970 to 2021. And I'm going to try to make the case today. This is another family planning poster from the early 1970s. It's Cultural Revolution. There's lots of images of Mao everywhere you look. Mao here, Mao's cap, Mao's little red book, and the title down. Whoops. Down here, in Chinese. Correct me if I'm wrong, native speakers in attendance. Planned births have advantages. So this was back in the mid-1970s when, and I think this kind of represents what the ideal family was for China's policymakers back in 1973, with a two-child limit. And here you do indeed see two children here, and in these other smaller blocks here, you also see two children. Here's an older daughter appears with a younger son in the wash basin, and a girl is being registered for school, and the baby boy being carried by the mother. And actually, this is kind of interesting because this two-child limit in the early 1970s, now in 2023, it appears that two children is a kind of a minimum that they would like people to have. If you look at that policy document from 2021, it actually calls for a three-child policy. But I don't think that there's a strong expectation that parents are going to have three children. But two children is what they're trying to encourage people to have, because so many are having just one. And maybe I'll stop here very briefly. Are there any quick questions in the chat or points of clarification that anybody would like to bring up? Nothing? Okay, well, let's go forward then. So I'd like to recap the debate so far in regard to the impact of this program. The basic question is, what would China's birth rates have been without this program? And the challenges in choosing a comparator is that you need to take development factors into account. Based on demographic transition theory, we know that birth rates in China would have fallen over the course of development, even without any program intervention. So I'm about to show you a graphic which shows the three comparators of the birth rate declines since 1970 that China might have had. And these are the ones that I used in my demography article in 2017. and all of them implicitly incorporate the developmental characteristics of the comparators. So I offered up India, which is another population billionaire, Vietnam, in part because it was the only country to implement a restrictive program anywhere near to what China tried to do. And then in the middle, I used a 16-country comparator average. And I'll say more about this in just a moment. So this is basically the schemata that I used. I started in 1970 when the total fertility rate was about 5.8. And based on these alternate patterns of birth rate declines, I was able to calculate the implied averted births as well as the averted population. This is basically the first figure that appears in that article in 2017. So based on, and oh, by the way, yeah, whoops. So I used the 16-country comparator as my middle scenario. That's the blue one here. So basically, all of the slides I'm about to show you compare the blue comparator to China's situation in red. So basically what I did is I ran two separate cohort component population projections. They're not shown here, based on these total fertility rates for both China and the comparator. And I ran them both forward from 1970. And the implication was that in 2021, when China completely got rid of all birth restrictions, the population was about 609 million lower than it would have been without the birth program since 1970. That's the implications of the 16-country comparator model. I'm trying to forward here. Appears to be stuck. Let's see, will it go forward? Okay. Ooh. Okay, so where did the 16-country comparator come from? It was actually proposed by Martin White, Wang Feng, and Yong Cai in the China Journal in 2015. This is a screenshot from a publication that they had. And there was also an earlier publication in 2013 in Population and Development Review. So basically, China had announced in 2006 that 400 million births were averted due to this program. There was some ambiguity about whether they were referring to the one-child policy or if they were referring to the whole Malthusian campaign since 1970. But these colleagues started in 1970, which I think is correct. They set up China's actual birth rates here in red, pardon the rather crude tracing, and they proposed their 16-country comparator, which is here in blue, which is an alternate path of birth rate decline. And here are the 16 countries that they used in that comparator. And as this debate got started, there was a suggestion that maybe these 16 countries were not as developed as China. And if that's the case, then that blue line might have too slow a fertility decline, because the more developed a society is, the more rapid fertility declines. So if that's the case, the blue line and the red might be too far apart. But when you actually look at the countries in that 16-country comparator, here in this block, I'm looking at the United Nations Human Development Index, which is a pretty broad index, which is based not simply on income with purchasing power parity. That's only 1/3 of the index. Another third is based on education, and another third is based on life expectancy at birth. And education and life expectancy at birth are dimensions on which socialist societies tend to do pretty well. So in this bar chart, I'm showing you China, which is in red, and the other countries for which a Human Development Index was available. I think it was not available for North Korea and maybe Uzbekistan, which is why you see some blanks there. And at least as of 1990, China's development was below that of all the other countries in the 16-country comparator. By 2019, China had caught up, but the point here is that the 16-country comparator seems to me to be pretty good because these societies, for most of this interval, were more developed than China was. Whoops. So here are the implications. Here we have now on the y-axis the population. We have China's population in orange and the projected population using that 16-country comparator all the way out to 2060 in blue. And what this is implying is that, again, in 2021, China's population was 609 million lower than it otherwise would have been, which implies that China would now have a population of 2 billion. In 2060, the difference is 1 billion. And you might ask yourself, well, how is that possible? Why should the gap be growing if China ended this program in 2021? And the explanation for that is shown in another graphic that was included in the demography article. The green bars here are showing you my estimates of averted births based on a comparison to that 16-country comparator. This is driven by the gap in fertility rates between China and that counterfactual. These are those births that were directly averted due to the program. But each birth directly averted due to the program also averts the entire family tree that would have followed it. So all of these green bars, those averted due directly to the program, would eventually become a purple bar. So when they would eventually grow up and get married, have kids in the counterfactual world, those family trees would continue to expand, but they would not in China. So here we are in 2021 with this policy document, and you see that there is a long legacy of this program because of this cross-generational effect of the birth planning program, even though it is ended as of 2021. And by the way, this is, I'm just showing you here the replication table of some of my colleagues who were challenging the numbers. The top panel here is showing you my original calculations of the averted populations that was published by Demography. The bottom panel is showing you their replication, and this is showing you the difference between my original calculations and their replication. You see a lot of zeros here, so there was really nothing wrong with the calculations that were presented. So I want to focus on this for a minute. I think it's important to distinguish what should not be controversial about this graphic or the prior slides versus what is controversial and deserves further scrutiny. Here we're looking at the population pyramid for China from in 1980, 2020, and 2060. China's actual population is in blue, and the counterfactual population under the 16-country comparator is in orange. So if you add up all that orange stuff there, both the slashed bars and the solid bars, you can see just how big an impact this program had when we start the projections in 1970. In 1980, that was 10 years into the program, and this later, longer, fewer era is represented by these dashed bars here. And as we come down and we look at 2020, the dashed bars are now up here because they're 40 years older. And the second generation averted population is the dashed area right down here. And the orange, the solid orange is showing those averted by one-child limits. So the overall orange mass here and the implications based on the previous model shouldn't be controversial at all, really. What is controversial is actually the labels that I used for these graphics. China's population averted by later, longer, fewer is represented by the diagonal slashed bars. The orange bars are labeled here, the population averted by one-child limits. That's actually not correct. And again, here's this ambiguous definition of one-child policy. The orange bars are showing you the population averted in the one-child era due to everything that was going on in the one-child era. So it's in part because I think this was ambiguous and mislabeled that I'm now going forward, and I'm trying to make this distinction between one-child limits and the one-child policy. So to save time, I think I'm going to skip over these graphics here. There was this debate about a bounce that I assumed in the original article. Feel free to bring this up in the Q&A if you like. So my new research question is, to what extent did one-child limits contribute to that 609 million population reduction owing to the Malthusian program that I just showed you? But there are a bunch of uncertainties before you can answer this question. The first one, and this is kind of surprising, when you get that out there in the literature, there isn't a lot of documentation about how many one-child families there even are in China, owing to the one-child era. There was an estimate put forward about a decade ago that it was about maybe 150 million. More recently, Susan Greenhalgh had an essay where she said it was about 200 million. I've done some informal calculations on this. I think the answer probably is about 200 million, so that's the one that I'm going to use here. But it's important to note that we really don't have very good documentation of this. Second, even if there are 200 million one-child families that emerged from this era, the question is how many emerged because of the program rather than developmental forces. So I'm going to just use kind of a broad experimental range. I'm going to assume that somewhere between 1/4 and 3/4, that is 50 to 50 million one-child families were created owing to the program. And then, as I showed earlier, we want to consider both the direct impact of the program and the indirect spillover effects across the generations, like I showed you in that earlier chart. So I'm calling what I'm about to show you kind of an exploratory Sudoku type analysis. I'm trying to figure out of the 609 million that were estimated to have been the population difference between the counterfactual case and China's own population. I'm trying to figure out how that 609 million should be divided up across the eras. In this top section here, I'm looking at the 1970s, that initial decade. And in the second panel, I'm looking at the one-child era forward from 1980 to 2021. And the bottom is the two of them combined. And then I'm trying to look at the distribution of the averted population based upon the birth order. Those due to one-child limits versus 2 or 3 child limits. And I'm also considering both the first and second generation effects, as I tried to explain earlier. So the boxes in green, I felt most confident about based on prior work that I've done. In the yellow boxes, I tried to make some calculations based on a variety of sources. I don't have time to go into all the details here, but I hope you can get a sense of what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to apportion that total population reduction to the various forces and eras that were involved. And here is the most interesting thing. What I'm trying to get to is the percent of the population reduction that was owing to one-child limits versus everything else. What I found that during the one-child era itself, when I worked through all these calculations, the only way in which we can assume that the majority, that is 52% of the population reduction, was due to one-child limits was if we trace across here and we assume that 150 million of the 200 million one-child families emerging in the one-child era was due to the program itself. And that seems to go against the grain of what most people seem to want to argue. Most people seem to want to argue that the majority of those one-child families were due to development. So they should be maybe down here, assuming maybe there was 50 out of the 200 million that were program created. And if that's the case, then one-child limits only account for about 17% of that total averted population. So that's the implication here. And again, there's a lot of detail here. I wish I had more time to go into it, but here is the kind of summary of the main finding of all that. The numerical impact of China's Malthusian program differs greatly based on how you define it. Of the 609 million population reduction as of 2021, my middle estimate, based on that 16 country comparator, is that 166 million were due to one-child limits when you define that very narrowly, but 475 million were due to the one-child policy program when it's broadly defined as all those enhanced bureaucratic enforcements and penalizations of all regulations, not just one-child limits. So definitions and language really matter here in trying to describe the impact of this program. And just checking the time here. Okay. I don't seem to be in time trouble here. So the problem with a narrow definition is that it doesn't really explain the other major consequence that has been regularly attributed to the one-child policy. And that is sex ratio imbalances. So the second major question I'm looking at here is, to what extent did one-child limits contribute to missing females? And let me try to explain the intuition behind this near universal belief that in societies where parents favor having sons, as fertility falls, there will be fewer opportunities for having a son. So by restricting parents to one birth, China's one-child policy led to millions of missing females due to excess use of prenatal sex selection. And if so, the sex ratio of first births should be notably distorted and account for the bulk of missing females. And this is pretty much the universal thing that you hear if you go out and you do an internet search and you look up the unintended consequences of the one-child policy. They'll say one of the main consequences was missing females because of prenatal sex selection. But what we're going to find in the reality is that actually fewer than 15% of China's missing females were first births. And you can figure this out simply by looking at the missing females by birth order. In China, as in many other countries, sex ratios of birth have been far more distorted at the second and third and higher birth orders. The normal sex ratio is about 106 males per 100 females. This is a snip from a report by forgetting his name, Li. He's at the Xi'an Jiaotong University, and he's showing the sex ratio by birth order: first order births, second order birth, third births. First births in China have been pretty normal. He was looking at data in this report from 1982 to 2005. But in the last two data sources that he used, the 2000 census and this 2005 mini census, once you get to the second birth, you find huge distortions of 140 or 150 males per 100 females. Third birth, the same thing. Fourth birth, same thing. In order to figure out the distribution of missing females, you need to first consider, what is the distribution of births by birth order. First births typically account for more than half of all Chinese births. So missing females by birth order can be determined simply by a weighted average. The sex ratio of distortions by birth order, as shown here, weighted by the percent distribution of all births at each birth order. And here is the result that I have so far. It is still a draft, but I'm working on checking on some of the underlying sources that I used for this graphic, but I think it's going to be pretty close to what I'm showing you here. Here we're showing you the cumulative number of missing births by birth order beginning in 1980 when one-child restrictions started and going until 2015 when they ended. And first births are being the first birth contribution to missing females is shown in orange. Second birth is shown in blue, and the third and higher order births is above that. And by the way, the sources for these calculations, annual births are coming from the United Nations World Population Prospects. The aggregate sex ratio at birth is coming from US Census Bureau. And then the distribution of births by birth order and the sex ratio at each birth order are coming from Chinese censuses and surveys, sometimes reported in third-party literature. So this chart is showing pretty clearly that the vast majority of missing females in China are not first births, but they're rather second births or second or third or higher order births. And what's just as interesting is for first births, the uptick doesn't seem to occur until almost 2010. So it makes you wonder, why would the contribution of first births to missing births not have occurred until then? Because they always could have used sex selection if they were interested in having a son. So these results are very different than what you usually hear when people talk about the one-child policy. Okay, so I'm a little ahead of where I expected to be. I could go back during the Q&A and describe some of those other slides, but I hope I've convinced you that in addition to the demography here, we really need to think about some of the language that we're using in order to understand this program. So some of the questions we might consider are why does the one-child policy misnomer persist? I think I'll skip ahead to the third bullet here. One of the unusual things about this topic is that a lot of the stakeholders in our field are not all that interested in acknowledging or even further investigating the numerical impact of the program, each for their own reasons. A lot of experts in the academy have come to different conclusions, and they've been resistant to the empirical findings that I've shown you today. I think the international family planning community has always been reluctant to talk about compulsion in the Chinese program. And now even the Chinese government, which used to point to that 400 million estimate of averted births as a sign of the success of the program, that statistic has pretty much disappeared. So they're not talking about numbers either. So there are a lot of new frontiers I'm hoping to open up for those who want to go there on the rise of China, the reasons for its rapid development, and the issue of demographic dividend, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm ending a bit early, but hopefully that means we have more time for questions. So thank you very much again for inviting me to give this presentation, and your comments and questions and criticisms are all welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And now I think the floor is open for comments, suggestions. Anyone?
May I come in?
Oh, good. Yeah,
So
please.
thank you very
much.
much.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel, for a wonderful presentation. I'm Muqaddar from UNFPA, Pakistan. I met a couple of times with you, if you remember, particularly for this population projection trainings. I really like the presentation you had. It's a wonderful, I particularly like your two slides, 19 and 25. My one question is on comparators. 16 countries comparators. When you look at the names of these comparators, all of them, they are scattered in different regions. They're not from one particular region where you can compare it really, because you're socially, culturally are linked with your regions. Whereas these comparators, it's belong to different regions. So what are the main reason, in fact, they took these 16 countries in terms of comparators? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that information was on one of the slides, but I was racing past it. They chose the 16 country comparator because those countries had birth rates in 1970 that were similar to what China had. So I think they went to a World Bank data series, and then they located the countries that were not putting in otherwise enacting forceful population control programs. India was not included, Vietnam was not included. So they basically just found those countries that had the closest birth rates to China. So that's why they're scattered around the world.
If I may, I would like to follow up with the last question regarding how to better account for the counterfactuals that, as you conceptualize, that could be like some fertility decline, like attributable to the policy itself, but some others due to developmental forces. And so I'm wondering, actually, given that some groups, such as some ethnic minorities in certain ethnically concentrated areas, are exempt from the one-child limits and are allowed to have a second one, or if the first girl if first birth is a girl and the second one is allowed. And I mean, so in the populations that are exempt from the one-child policy, and so to what extent that they really make use of such an exemption and having a second child. And I believe the extent of that policy utilization reflects to some extent the strength of the developmental forces, right? And even though they are allowed to do so, they still decided not. And so I'm curious about how to account for this component of counterfactuals.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess there could be ways to refine the counterfactuals. I think what in this initial work, I wanted to start with the counterfactual that my colleagues had proposed. I thought that was the safer thing to do when I originally used theirs as the central comparator. I'm not sure how it would work if you're working with ethnic minorities. Yeah, I mean, I've heard the argument that even even those who had the opportunity to have the second child chose not to, and that's actually true. But some actually did. Let me bring up 2 points. First, I think there's some confusion in the literature and the way we usually have of describing things. We usually use the term parents are exempt from the one-child policy. I've used that term myself as well, but it's actually inaccurate because, I mean, technically, yes, some parents were exempt from one-child limits, but they were not exempt from two-child limits.
Right.
And others were exempt from two-child limits, but they were not exempt from three-child limits, and so on and so on. To my knowledge, every Chinese citizen faced a birth ceiling. So it's I think it's important to recognize those sort of reverse cascading limits to which people were subjected. This was brought out really well in an article by Gu Bachang and some of his colleagues in Population and Development Review a while back. Developmental forces, yeah, they get very, very tricky. But again, at least that 16-country comparator at the aggregate level does appear to incorporate the developmental forces based on the Human Development Index. There might be a way to refine that, but I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. Hu Shu has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. My question is related to the previous questions by Mu Zheng. It's also about the counterfactual case. You particularly mentioned India and Vietnam as the comparator. I'm thinking, so for India and China, it could be a good comparison, especially if the focus is on missing women or aborted female births, since both countries have a strong history, tradition of some preference, and both countries are very large in terms of population size. So in that sense, yes, India could be a good comparator. But on the other hand, if we look at, female labor force participation, then there's a huge difference between China and India. And of course, then in terms of economic development, the speed of urbanization, growing economy and employment in the second sector, in the third sector, in that case, yeah, I feel, I think women's education level and labor force participation are big factors in determining the fertility. So in that sense, India may not be a good comparator for China. So I'm not sure if this is a question, but I would really like you to talk, to discuss in details the rationale behind choosing India and Vietnam
Right.
for your study on China. And my second is, well, it's not a question, but a comment. So in one of the slides, you were showing the sex ratios by parity. So it seems from the figure, sex ratios only began to tick up since the 2010s, at least for the first birth. And I would like to just offer a tentative explanation for this. I'm thinking maybe because since the 2010 onwards, urbanization level in China has reached a high level. And in this case, and China has had a very ultra low fertility, similar to its East Asian neighbors. And it has been going on for a while. So maybe in the recent decade, because of high urbanization level and because of the low fertility kind of a culture or norm is firmly established, so that now that many families, they are only considering about having one child. So the sex ratio, so they in the first birth is beginning to show. But before this era, probably because for the first birth, for many parents, especially for those who are allowed to have a second child, their the motivation to practice sex selection is stronger in the second birth, but not in the first. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Those are great questions. Thank you. To start with the comparators, yeah, I fully agree with all of the comments you just made about India. My motivation for including India was, as you mentioned, in part just because it's the other demographic billionaire. And today there's an awful lot of talk about, when will or did India surpass China as the world's largest, most populous country? And I think having India as a comparator is helpful there. I don't think India would have surpassed China for many, many decades if China had not put this program in place. So I agree that it's not an ideal comparator for estimating the averted population of China, but I thought it was at least one bookend which could provide a high estimate. And on the lower one for Vietnam, one of the reasons I included it is because I had done that field study for a year looking at its 1 or 2 child policy. And again, I think Vietnam put in place a program that was probably closer to what China did than any other country in the world. But even so, it was nothing like what China did. The penalties were much smaller. They were only enforced in the Red River Delta area around Hanoi. And the penalties for transgressions were typically maybe 2 or 3 months worth of rice in kilograms, much less than they were in China. So I thought Vietnam was an example where you really had a forceful population policy, or as forceful as you could get compared to what China's was. And then those are the 2 that I started with. And then I said, okay, well, I want another one. I'm looking for a third one. And then I realized why reinvent the wheel, because there was already that 16-country comparator that was out there. So that's why I went with that one, and that became the central comparator. And then when I saw that developmental factors were already fully incorporated in it, it seemed to be quite reasonable from my perspective. And then you raise all kinds of interesting questions about the sex ratios. Yeah, the sex ratios of first births didn't really tick up until around 2010. I puzzled over this for many years based on that initial finding from the 2010 census. I thought it was an aberration. I thought it might be related to the year of the tiger. 2010 was a tiger year, and there was actually a dip in China's fertility, just like there was in Singapore. And I thought maybe it could be due to they were concerned about their first and only birth being a tiger in China. That was my theory from several years ago. But the 2020 census shows that the first birth sex ratio is still very high. It's about 114 per 114 male births per 100 female births. And that's much, much higher than any other country. It's extremely unusual. So my conclusion is that that big increase in the sex ratio of first births was largely voluntary because there were no additional pressures on parents institutionally to limit them to one birth. In fact, the exemptions were gradually increasing over time because of the demographics. If both parents were only children, then they were allowed to have a second. And demographically, because fertility rates 30 years earlier had come down, gradually more and more parents were qualifying for the exemptions. So I think it was largely voluntary. One quick other point here, the 2020 census is really interesting because the second birth sex ratio has come way down. Now the first birth and the third birth sex ratios are much higher than the second birth. The second birth has come down, I think, in part because I have to get into the specifics of the program, but in rural areas, they had a 1.5 child policy. You could have a second if the first was a daughter. If you had a son, you were one son and done. So all these rural parents were left with singleton sons. But and there is son preference, but parents still like to have a balance. So I think a lot of parents took advantage of having a second child after 2015. A lot of rural parents already had a son, so they were using sex selection. They were less likely to use sex selection against daughters, or they might be more likely to use it against sons so that they got their balance. It's a very unusual pattern in the 2020 census. I wish I had more time to talk about it. I hope I answered all your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So any other questions and comments from the audience?
I could maybe add one point briefly. We have one more minute. I'm a little over. The second half of this presentation, I didn't think that I'd have time to present it, but the follow-up to this paper, the point that I'm trying to make is not that one-child limits did not matter. They did matter. And I think there are some misunderstandings about what happened after the 2015 lifting of all one-child restrictions. A lot of people say that, overall birth rates only went up by about 5 or 6%. So that indicates that it was no longer a constraint. But because marriage rates are skyrocketing in China, first births are coming way down. And when you take that into account, second births actually went up by a lot more than you would realize based on the aggregate statistics. And this second birth baby boom in China actually extended far further. So it lasted from about 2016 to 2019. And the average increase compared to 2015 was about 20% per year. And you can see that once you disaggregate births by birth order. So that was the second part of this presentation I would have liked to have given, but I didn't think I had time.
Thank you. I guess if no further questions, it's already been midnight at your end, right, Daniel? And thank you so much for a very a wonderful talk, and I've learned so much from it. I believe the audience as well. And good afternoon and good night, and I hope all will have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.